Hello and welcome to our Career Connect Spotlight event featuring our friends and partners from Polar Bear International. We're excited to have students and classrooms joining us from across the country, and we just want to welcome you. And while we wait for additional classrooms to join us, we're going to go ahead and use a discovery education spotlight on strategy called the 6-word story. And in the image, you are going to determine what you think that image is of, and you are going to summarize that image using 6 words. Give you a moment. I'm going to go ahead and share more information on our guests in just a moment. But before I do, let me share some more details about this new series that you all are joining us for, which is Discovery Education's Career Connect Spotlight event. Career Connect Spotlight is a virtual series that allows multiple classrooms just like yours from across the country and the world to tune in live and hear from subject matter experts in a huge range of career fields, like scientists from Polar Bear International that you're going to meet today. This series is brought to you by Discovery Education's exciting new platform called Career Connect. Which connects classrooms like yours to industry, skills, and people like the scientists you're going to meet today who power and change the world around us. Our goal for Career Connect is really to make it easier for students like yourselves to connect with all kinds of professionals and discover real-world connections that you're already learning about in your classroom. So we hope these connections will inspire you to dream really big and consider what you might want to be when you grow up. So my name is Kimberly Wright, and I'm a former science teacher, and now I work at Discovery Education as an instructional design manager. And all that basically means is when you log into Discovery Education, all that content that you see, I am one of the many people who create that content for you. And I'm really excited to be your host today for our Career Connect Spotlight event. In today's Spotlight, I'm excited to formally introduce Louise Archer. And Louise is a Polar Bear International Research Fellow. Her research combines ecological modeling, bioenergetics to understand how polar bear populations will respond to rapid Arctic warming and resulting in the declines of sea ice. We are thrilled to have her joining us live from the tundra as a Career Connect Spotlight guest. We also want to welcome our friends joining us from Craven County, North Carolina. And we understand that they have some questions for you today, Louise. And we can't wait to hear what those curiosity questions are. We're going to take one moment real quick and take a pause. We are having a few technical difficulties, and our classroom is actually having some difficulty connecting. Louise, would you mind, since our classroom is having some difficulty connecting, why don't we allow our guests that are watching virtually to kind of decide and guess what it is that you do using another SOS strategy called Emoji Share?
Hi, everyone. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and some of the research work that I'm doing. So I work as a research fellow with Polar Bears International, and I'm trying to piece together little bits of data to understand how polar bears across the Arctic are responding to changing sea ice conditions and climate warming. And the way I do that is using math and modeling. So building equations to describe what's happening with polar bears and using that to try and get some insight into what's happening with their future as well. So it's really combining lots of different areas, learning about polar bear biology, taking information from field researchers, so people who are going out studying bears on the sea ice, and then piecing that together using math and equations to understand what different populations might be facing as the climate warms. So with that, I'll take a pause and hand right back over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Louise. This has been a fun journey, and we're so glad that you're joining us today. You have an absolutely amazing career and do such incredibly important work. And truly, the work that you do is an inspiration for our students across the country and the world. And we really can't wait to learn more from you today. I understand that our students from Craven County Schools, our middle school students, hi, friends. How are you all doing today? We're so glad you're here and that you connected with us.
And you hear us. The question.
We can hear you. Woo, yes. Yeah, we're good. Yay. So I do have to say, we're joining you from multiple locations across North America right now. So we did have to overcome some tech difficulties, but we're on it and we're ready for your questions, friends from Craven County. We're excited to hear your curiosity questions. Would you like to share your questions with Louise?
Yes. Hi, my name is Gabby, and my question is, what are some misconceptions people have about polar bears?
Hi, Gabby. Thanks for the question. So there are a few misconceptions about bears. I think one of the biggest one I often hear is that polar bears and penguins live together. So that actually is not true. We know that polar bears live in the Arctic, so in the very, very high north, but penguins live down in the south. So penguins are in and around Antarctica. So you'll actually never see polar bears and penguins together in the wild. So that's one misconception about polar bears. And then a second one that you sometimes hear is that polar bears live on land, which also is not the case. We know that polar bears are a marine mammal. They live on the sea ice in particular, so the frozen Arctic Ocean. Sometimes bears come on land when sea ice melts, but they truly are a marine species that rely on sea ice. So there are some of the misconceptions that we tend to hear, but a really, really good question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, you ready? Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jayla, and my question is, what kind of jobs are available while working with polar bears?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much, because there is such a variety of jobs you can do that will connect you to polar bears and can help conserve polar bears as well. So I guess one of the big ones is working as a scientist or a researcher, so someone like me. There's lots of different ways you can research and work in science with polar bears. So everything from being a field researcher, where you're going out on the sea ice, capturing bears, taking samples from the field, collecting the really important data. You can also work in the lab, so analyzing samples that come in from the field, doing chemical analyses, things like that. If you're a little bit more mathy, so someone like me, you can work on the data analysis side of things. So that means building models, taking data, trying to find trends. So that's another job. And then, of course, you can also work in communications about polar bears. So just like we're doing today, it's really important to share the research and the information that we're gathering about bears. So you can get to talk to people about bears, you can share information, so share the science. That would be more of a science communicator role. As well as that, we also have management working with bears. So polar bear populations need to be managed. So we have wildlife managers that work with polar bear populations. So trying to ensure that bears are monitored and managed correctly and safely. And then you can also work in a zoo setting. So there's zoo professionals who work with captive polar bears. So that's kind of a selection as just some of the jobs that you could have that are all involved in polar bear work. And then, of course, working with a polar bear organization that's conserving bears. So a conservation organization focused on polar bears as well would be another great option for a job with polar bears. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you.
That's a great question.
Question number 3.
My name is Maya, and my question is, can you describe your typical day working with polar bears?
Yeah, thanks, Maya. That's a great question. And again, it kind of varies depending on what kind of polar bear job you're in. So for your researcher or your scientist, Your typical day is going to involve a lot of meetings. So because we work as a team, usually, it's not just one person doing polar bear work. We often are meeting with colleagues, discussing projects, research projects that we're working on, planning out field seasons as well, the type of data we're going to collect. So that can be part of the day. We then might do some data analysis. So all that data we collected, we'll start to analyze it, build models of it, do some statistics, maybe do some writing as well. So writing papers is a big part of science and research. So that forms part of the day. Might also do some lab work. So that means spending time in the lab, analyzing samples that we can get in. So for things like genetics, hormones, so really hands-on lab work, the kind of stuff you might be doing in a white coat. And then if you're going to be doing more of the field work, your day might look a little bit different. So that will typically involve getting up early in the morning, checking the weather to make sure it's safe to get out, and usually setting up sample collections and then flying in a helicopter to where polar bears are, taking some measurements from bears that have been sedated, so collecting things like hair and blood and weight, things like that. And then when you get back home to your research base, you'll start to process those samples. So those can be some of the longest days when you're working as a biologist or a research scientist, when you're actually out in the fields handling animals. But it can look pretty different at different times of the year. But it's a really, really good question because there's such a variety of tasks that we do.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Willie, and I'd like to know one of the biggest challenges for polar bear conservation.
That is a great question. And for polar bears, we know that the biggest challenge facing them is climate warming, which is causing sea ice to melt. And because polar bears need the sea ice as a platform to hunt, so they walk across the sea ice, catching seals, which are their main prey. And the melting of sea ice with climate warming is the biggest challenge for them. And this is a pretty big challenge to address. It requires people all across the world to participate and to take action to slow down rates of climate warming. So that's one of the biggest challenges is getting people across the world to see and understand this problem that's facing polar bears and start taking action to improve and protect their future as well. So that's really the biggest challenge facing polar bears. Another challenge is, of course, that as polar bears are faced with more and more sea ice loss, they tend to spend more time on land closer to humans. And that means that there can be a challenge of keeping both humans and polar bears safe in communities in the north where they might see polar bears moving through their areas at different parts of the year. So that's another problem is how to deal with keeping both people and polar bears safe as sea ice melts and polar bears spend more time near communities. So they're some of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now. But luckily, we've got a lot of people who are really, really interested in trying to solve these challenges. So that was a great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think this is our last question from our class.
Hi, my name is Logan, and I am wondering, how do you measure the health and population of polar bears?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. And there are a lot of different ways that we measure health and population status of bears. So one of the first things that we look at when it comes to polar bear health is how fat a bear is. So for polar bears, it's all about being fat. You want to be as big as possible because that's what allows them to thrive on the sea ice. It can be difficult for them to catch seals, so they may have to go for weeks between a meal. So they need to be really, really fat. So weighing the bear and seeing how big it is and measuring what we call its body condition, so the condition and the weight of the bear is one of the key ways that we measure their health. So for polar bears, it's all about being fat. And this can be done by researchers that can capture polar bears safely in the wild, weigh them, and then release them. So that's one of the key ways that we measure the health of polar bears. We also look at their reproduction too. So we want to know how many cubs polar bears are having, the survival rate of the cubs, and that gives us an indication through time how well the population is doing. So if there's lots of cubs, they're surviving pretty well, that usually tells us that the population is doing pretty well and it's healthy. And then the last way that we would look at to measure population health is by counting polar bears. So we need to know how many polar bears are in different populations and whether those numbers change through time. And one of the key ways that we can do this is called an aerial survey. So that's when researchers will fly over specific areas where they expect to find polar bears and count the number of bears they see from the plane. And then they can use some statistics to then understand how many bears are in that population. And if they do that through time, so say every 5 years or so, they can start to see whether the number of bears is changing, if it's increasing or decreasing, and that tells us a lot about the health of the population. So if we see the numbers going down, we know the population isn't doing so well. If we see them stay the same, then that tells us that that population is doing okay at that point in time. So it's a really, really good question because we're always thinking about how individual bears are doing, but also how the overall population is doing too. So yeah, that's a really nice question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, students, for sharing your curiosity questions with Louise. Louise, we now have some questions that we'd like to share with you that were submitted from some of our viewers. Is that okay if I share those with you now?
Of course, yeah. Love answering polar bear questions.
Okay, awesome. So how is it that humans are impacting the lives of polar bears?
Yeah, so the biggest way that humans are impacting the lives of polar bears is by burning fossil fuels. So that causes the temperature in our atmosphere to warm. And what we've seen is as climate has warmed over time, it's led to sea ice melt. So because temperatures are warming as we're burning fossil fuels, so things like oil and coal and gas, that creates a heat trapping blanket effect. So these emissions of carbon, they gather in the atmosphere and it creates this blanket which causes our environment to warm. That warming then melts the sea ice that polar bears need to move and to hunt from. And that then impacts their overall populations because it's hard for them to catch seals when they don't have the sea ice platform they need. So that's the biggest way that we're impacting polar bears. Is by causing the climate to warm, which means that they lose their sea ice habitat that they depend on.
Wow. Okay, so that is a great question. Thank you so much for answering that one. Our next question is, do polar bears have families?
Yeah, that's also a great question. And the answer is that it depends. If it's a female polar bear, so a polar bear mom, she will have a family for about 2.5 years. So she'll give birth to her cubs in the den, usually between 1 to 3 cubs. And those cubs will stay with her for up to 2.5 years. So during that time, the female and her cubs will act as a little family. They'll travel together on the sea ice. The cubs will learn to hunt by watching their mom. They'll feed on milk that she provides them. So they're what we consider a family during that time. The male polar bears, so the polar bear fathers, they're not involved in this family. They won't see their own cubs during this whole time. It's just mom and her babies that act as a family during this time. So when we talk about polar bears' families, what we're talking about is female bears and their cubs.
Wow, 2 years is a long time in the animal world, right? So that's a great question as well. So our next question is, how long can polar bears hold their breath?
Yeah, it's quite surprising because we know polar bears are good swimmers, so they can swim long distances, but we also know that they can dive under the water when they're swimming. And they can hold their breath for quite a long time when they're diving. So the longest that I know of on record is 3 minutes and 10 seconds. So polar bear that dove underwater, yeah. So in the Norwegian Arctic, in a region called Svalbard, a polar bear was observed to dive underwater and it came up 3 minutes and 10 seconds later. So that's a really, really long time for a polar bear to hold its breath. But it does show us just how comfortable they are in the water. Though for them, they prefer to move around on top of the water on the sea ice. But if they have to, they can definitely do well in the water too.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, well, why do polar bears, and I think you kind of answered this, but it's another question that dives in just a little bit deeper, but why do polar bears live where they live?
Yeah, so for polar bears, the biggest thing that matters to them is having sea ice. And we see sea ice forms in the Arctic as the Arctic waters get cold enough. So you can see in your screen maybe here that sea ice forms as the Arctic gets cold in the winter. Right in the very high north, it'll stay there year round. But then it melts in the summertime, kind of in these lower northerly regions. But for polar bears, the key thing is that they have sea ice for a big part of the year that allows them to hunt seals. And we usually find polar bears in shallower coastal waters, so in and around coastlines where you have sea ice forming, but where you get a lot of seals in those waters by coastlines because they're very productive. There's a lot of life in the water. You get sunlight that penetrates through the sea ice that stimulates what we call the Arctic food chain. So you'll have all this growth from the sea ice, starting with algae, these tiny, tiny, tiny little algae that live in the sea ice. Those algae provide the energy for the entire food chain. So it all starts with the sea ice, the algae that live in the ice, and then all that energy is transferred up to polar bears, which use the ice to catch seals. So for them, sea ice is essential for their existence. And we know we find sea ice in the very, very far north where it gets cold. So that's why we find polar bears in the Arctic.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much for that one. And I'm going to give you our last question of the day from our viewers that very much has to do with sea ice as well. Since polar bears are spending more time on land due to diminishing ice, are they more susceptible to virus and disease?
Yep, that's a really good question because typically there's not so much disease and viruses in the Arctic. It's a pretty simple food chain there, so we haven't historically seen so much disease and viruses in polar bears. But as they're spending more time on land, they're encountering different pathogens, so different bacteria, viruses, parasites that can infect them. And that does seem to be something we're seeing more frequently in polar bears and is directly related to the time they're spending on land. As the Arctic warms, we also see new species moving from warmer regions into the Arctic. And those species that are moving further north, they're bringing their parasites and their diseases with them. And that means it can be an introduction of new disease and new parasites into polar bears that they may have not experienced before. So these are the kind of things that we see happening as we see habitats changing with climate warming.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. It really shows like how interconnected we are on planet Earth, right? So thank you for that incredible, important work that you're doing with our wonderful polar bears. And with that, we are actually at time. So Lisa, just want to give you a huge thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with our students in Craven County and also with our students viewing from around the world. But also students from Craven County, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of your wonderful curiosity questions with us. We hope you continue to be solution seekers and curious about polar bears. So thank you so much for joining us. Teachers that are tuning in today, if you're interested to learn more about Career Connect, which is what this program is brought to you by, we ask you to join careerconnect.discoveryeducation.com and join the waitlist to have your own class connect with professionals from leading organizations. And don't forget that we do have another upcoming spotlight event at the top of the next hour featuring another scientist from Polar Bears International. And keep in mind that we will continue having these events throughout the school year. And we hope you'll have the opportunity to join us not only at the top of the next hour, but also with our future events as well. But for now, we just thank you so much for joining us. And Louise, thank you again And thank you all for watching us, watching this Career Connect Spotlight event. And we can't wait to see you soon. Have a great day. Thanks for joining.